Hello, everyone. My name is Justin Crowley, and this is The Murder Project. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 48 of The Murder Project. I'm glad to be back with you guys recording a new episode, and we have a bit of a mystery for you guys this week. This week, we're going to be covering the case of Jessica Renee Johnson and kind of everything that goes in with that as far as this mystery goes. Now, we have a police investigation that has ruled this death as a suicide, and then we have the family that is saying that Jessica was in fact murdered. So I know that on the internet, the opinions go slightly towards that she was murdered, but I can tell you that there are a lot of things that are happening in this case, and I want to break them all down for you. Now, in this episode, remember that I give you the details, and in the next episode, when Mike comes in on the debrief, we kind of break it down and go through it. But I'm going to give you the details. It is quite crazy. Before we get started, I just want to give a shout out to everybody that got on to Apple and Spotify and subscribed to the page, as well as anybody else who's been listening on any of the other platforms. I do know that we had 2 people go on to Apple Podcast and give us a 5-star rating and a review, and I will read those off next week when Mike is with us. So you still have time. If you want to get in there and give us a review, please go do that. It helps us get noticed in the platforms, and it helps us get out to more people. It doesn't cost you anything, and we appreciate it. Just go on, subscribe to the podcast. If you're on Spotify or another platform, if it'll let you. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, go ahead, click the app open, scroll down past the episodes where you see the stars, tap that 5 stars, and if you would be so kind, leave us a review. We appreciate it. So let's get into this week's episode. It has a lot of different factors that come into play as far as whether we can say, yes, this is a suicide, or yes, this is a murder, or is this thing undetermined? Because now that we're looking at this case several years past, we're going to find out that not only do we have access to information involved in the case, but we don't have access to some of the evidence that is involved in this case. So this is when things can get a little bit tricky as far as trying to decide what happened to someone so many years ago. So this case is about Jessica Renee Johnson and her unfortunate death. Now, to give you a little bit of backstory on Jessica, she is from Horn Lake, Mississippi, and she was last seen by her family on May 31st, 2017. She is going to be found deceased on June 2nd, 2017. So a few days later, as far as the timeline goes, but what happened in those few days is the biggest mystery of all. So leading up to June 2nd, Jessica is last seen by her family, as I mentioned, on May 31st. Now, her family did speak with her on June 1st, which is the next day, and she stated that she would be back home the very next day or soon. So at this time, Jessica is a single mother of 2 children. She is living with her family, and she is staying with sometimes her on-again, off-again boyfriend, Garland Hart. When Jessica leaves the house, she says that she is going to go hang out with Garland for a little bit. She mentions that they are going to go shopping and go to a thrift store and kind of try to find some clothes for Garland. And after spending some time with him, she would return. The only thing is that she never returns. On June 1st, she does make contact with her family. She even FaceTimes her children and speaks with them, and she lets her mom know she'll be back soon. So Jessica, at this point, vanishes. No one hears from her again as far as on the phone. There are some text messages that she receives kind of back and forth during this time, but no one ever actually in her family physically sees her again alive. Talking about Garland and giving you some info on him, Garland Hart is someone that Jessica has been dating for a few years at this time. It is someone that her family says is not typical for Jessica to date, by way of he's kind of hangs with the rougher crowd. He has been known to dabble in the drug scene. He's got tattoos basically from his neck down to his feet. And it's just not somebody that Jessica's family said that she normally hangs out with. The behavior change for Jessica and the people that she started hanging out with started several years before this. What we do know is back in 2013, she started hanging out with a guy that is kind of in this crowd, this rougher crowd, as they say. Deals in drugs, does drugs. And this is when they think the change for Jessica kind of begins. When she goes from a girl who would not normally be seen hanging out with certain individuals to being involved with these said individuals and involved in their same lifestyles. And what I mean by that specifically is that Jessica had not really been in any sort of trouble in her life, but after she started hanging out with this guy in 2013, and he was a drug dealer, she was arrested with him in a vehicle for possession of a controlled substance. So methamphetamines, cocaine, something like that. And when she got arrested, she was later released and the charges were dropped, but her boyfriend at the time was sent to prison. So in a way, this was something good. Her family thought it kind of put a separation between Jessica and this boyfriend that they weren't really too happy that she was with. But Jessica didn't really get out of the lifestyle. She kind of hung out with similar people, kind of stayed in the crowd. And a few years later, she would start dating Garland Hart. Garland Hart is basically the carbon copy of the guy that she was dating that went to prison. And when she is dating Garland, there is accusations of physical and mental abuse and also drug use. Jessica's family knows that she has at this time kind of started dabbling with Xanax and methamphetamines, that she's kind of getting caught up in this lifestyle. I think that's also why you kind of see her living with her parents and her children are living with her parents. She was working regularly up until all this happened, and at the time of her death, she had not been employed for several years. And when we look at this from kind of the outside looking in, especially if we're familiar with this sort of lifestyle, these are kind of all of these telltale signs that somebody is getting involved in a place where perhaps they shouldn't be. She was able to hold a steady job, and now she can't. She would not typically be seen with certain individuals, but now she is. She did not have a drug history previous to this, but now she does. And when you get into a situation like this, I feel like for Jessica, maybe she did not intentionally step into this realm, but now it's here and it's present, and she is kind of searching for a way to get out. As I mentioned previously, she leaves and she is said to be with Garland, and they're going to be doing some shopping for clothes and hanging out. But one of the things that comes up in between all of this and her supposed time coming home is that Jessica is with Garland over at one of his friend's house, and he lives outside in kind of a rural area of Mississippi. It's out in the middle of nowhere from what it looks like on the pictures, and she is hanging out with him, and there is some sort of altercation that starts between Jessica and Garland. Now, while all this is going on, Jessica calls one of her friends, and she says that she wants her friend to come pick her up. And there is a lot of information, a lot of dialogue that her friends and family give, and I'll kind of go through some of that in the next part. But either way, Jessica's friend says that she receives a call from Jessica, and she wants to be picked up because her and Garland are having issues. They are fighting, they're arguing. There's apparently some sort of gathering going on, and perhaps there are other women over there. I've heard different stories as to how this kind of plays out. And as we know in the true crime realm, there's a lot of different things, a lot of different stories that get mixed up. But I heard that there was at Garland's friend's house, there was kind of a party going on. There could have been some other women there that perhaps were interested in Garland, or Garland was interested in, and it made some sort of fight happen between the two, and Jessica was really upset. Her friend did state that she knew that Garland was verbally abusive towards Jessica and also physically abusive, and that they had tried to get her out of this relationship, but she never really got a hold of it and got away. One of the things that she says is that Jessica was perhaps trying to help these guys out that she was dating, that she realized that they were struggling. She thought maybe she could help them out. And then she kind of ended up in the weeds, as they say, with them, and was struggling to find her own way out at this point. Jessica says, and her family say, that she loved Garland and that she was trying to figure out a way to make it all work. But at the same time, she knew that the relationship was toxic and she would leave, but somehow she always kind of got Drew back into that situation, which I know that from some messages I heard that she posted on Facebook, it appears that she was in love with Garland, that she wished that she could be with him in sort of a healthy relationship, but she knew the relationship was toxic and she just kind of got trapped. And I know I've brought this up before already in this short amount of time, but I keep coming back to it because in my brain, I realized like she loved this guy, but she knew he was no good for her, but she kept coming back to him because maybe she thought that there was a way to help. There's a way that she could make it work. There's a way that she could fix it. And unfortunately for her, it's not going to be that situation. So let's go to June 1st. She talks with her family. She FaceTimes her children, and she says that she is still hanging out with Garland, and G, as he's sometimes referred to, and that she will be home soon. So after this, you have the party kind of over at Garland's friend's house, supposedly. Jessica calls her friend, says, things are going bad. I need you to come pick me up. Jessica's friend shows up to the house to pick her up, but somewhere in between the time that Jessica's friend got there, she has changed her mind, and she says that she doesn't want to leave. Jessica's friend will go on record to say that these are the kind of people that you wouldn't want to hang out, and these are the kind of places that you wouldn't want to be. I don't know specifically what that means, but I would assume it would be kind of more the party crowd, kind of more the drug crowd, maybe some unsavory individuals that are hanging about, sketchy, some people you don't know, maybe they give you the wrong vibes. But she is trying to talk Jessica into leaving, but Jessica decides to stay. So at some point during that time, she decides that she is also going to leave, and she leaves Jessica at this residence. What happens after that is sort of the mystery, because there is a large gap of time between when people say that they last saw Jessica and when Jessica is actually found. Now, a lot of people at the house say that they were hanging out over there and that Jessica left. There's also some speculation that Garland was there and then he left. And then the friend that owned the house says that in one breath, he says that he hadn't seen Jessica and Garland together in a month, 2 months. And then in the next breath, he's like, oh, yeah, they were at my house the night before, but everybody kind of left and we're not really sure, where she went. But what we do know is that on June 1st, she was at Garland's friend's house. Now, after that, say around 9 o'clock, it's a little iffy as to what happens. It kind of gets into the midnight hours. So now we're getting into June 2nd, 2017. At 3:29 a.m. on June 2nd, Jessica sends a text message to her son, her oldest son, and in that text message, she says that she is going to be spending some more time with G, and I'm paraphrasing here. She's going to be spending some more time with G, and that she'll be home the following day or be home soon. Later on that same morning on June 2nd, a mail carrier is out delivering mail at around 9 a.m. in the morning, and she pulls up to the house that Jessica was last seen at to deliver the mail. When she arrives, she sees that Jessica is in a kneeling position, resting up against a mailbox. There were 2 shoelaces that had been tied together and kind of looped around her neck in a figure 8, and it was hooked around the top of the mailbox post, and essentially it looked like she had hung herself in a sort of seated position against this mailbox. After the mail carrier finds her, she immediately notifies police. But one of the interesting things that she does is that she calls one of her fellow employees and also tells him about it and ask him if he would come and sit with her until the police arrive. This is going to be a mistake, but I don't see that she tried to do this in any sort of way that would hinder the investigation. I think she was just doing it out of a place of comfort. When this other mail carrier arrives, he pulls up to the mailbox. Both the vehicles are basically parked in front of the mailbox. The United States Postal Service vehicles are parked in front of the mailbox. And before the police arrive, the mail carrier that came out second goes through Jessica's purse, which is kind of sat between her legs in this kneeling position, and gets her wallet out and gets her ID out of that wallet. So immediately in the beginning of this case, we already have someone who has tampered with the evidence, probably not meaning to. He's probably thinking to himself, hey, let's figure out who this girl is. I'll be able to provide her driver's license to the police when they get here, and I'm helping out in the investigation, not thinking that he is contaminating the evidence by sticking his hand in her purse and rifling through it to get her wallet, which will come into play later, and get her ID out of it. When the police arrive, they take the ID from the man. They kind of assess the situation, and what they find is that Jessica has committed suicide by hanging herself. Later on, during a preliminary autopsy, it was stated that Jessica's cause of death was asphyxiation and further ligature hanging. And that is what they listed as Jessica's cause of death on her death certificate. This is one of the things that upsets her family because they don't believe that this is exactly what happened. During this preliminary autopsy, they also found that she had intoxicating levels of Xanax and methamphetamines in her body, but these things would not be her cause of death because, as they stated, her cause of death was ligature hanging. Some other details that kind of go into the scene when Jessica was found is that her shoes were found close by her body. The laces were removed from the shoes. Her purse that was sitting between her legs in that knelt down position, the purse strap on that was broken, and her left hand had a lot of strange marks on it. And there are some pictures available online that kind of show these details. In one of them, her face is blurred out. So if you can handle that sort of thing, you can kind of get on there and check it out and kind of see exactly what they're talking about here. But the left hand has a lot of odd, either chemical burn or some sort of markings on it that I'm not quite able to kind of nail down as what did these things. Also, there is some obvious blood on her pinky finger, around her pinky fingernail, and it looks like there is a bruise on her left wrist as well. Another thing I would like to point out if you do view this photo is look at the way that the shoelace is around her neck and the way that her hair is caught into this shoelace, because all of these things are kind of going to come into play whenever Mike and I break this case down a little bit further. I did mention that there was a preliminary autopsy done, but as far as an actual autopsy done on Jessica, there was not one performed to find out any further details, and that kind of feels like a misstep. And unfortunately, after her body was released, and as the police are kind of still looking into this, she was cremated. And the reason that she was cremated is financial responsibilities of the family. Her family was put in a position where they had a loved one. You know, her parents had a daughter, her kids had a mother, and the rest of the family had a relative that passed away unexpectedly, and they were not able to provide the funds necessary for a burial. So in a situation like this, you have someone who is financially strapped, and they are told, okay, it's going to be $10,000, $12,000 to bury this person, or we can cremate them for $2,000. And I'm making these numbers up as I go, but I'm sure they're pretty close. But if they're in a situation where they might be able to come up with $2,000, they're definitely in a situation where they can't come up with $10,000, $12,000 plus. So they have to make the hard decision to cremate Jessica. And that is going to be very unfortunate because that kind of seals the deal on going back and having any further evidence collected or an actual autopsy done that can dive a little deeper into what happened to Jessica. Now, as far as the investigation goes into this, as I mentioned, the police are pretty certain that this is a suicide, so they don't really dig too deep into it, in my opinion, on any other alternate avenues, like anything else that could have happened in this case. Now, we know that in some point they have talked to the boyfriend, or they were kind of talking to some people that were involved in Jessica's life. And her on again, off again boyfriend, Garland, says that he was the last person to speak with Jessica. He said that he received a text message from Jessica where she kind of talked about freeing herself from her pain. And there were other people that were supposedly at this gathering that may or may not have happened that said that she made mention of wanting to get away from it all, or not being able to deal with the things that were going on. And her family is going to claim that she is just talking about the toxic relationship that she is in with Garland, not that she is talking about taking her life. Her family is very adamant about the fact that they do not believe Jessica would commit suicide. And if she did, that she would not do it in the manner of which it was done. They said that because she had this addiction to Xanax, that she probably would have taken an overdose of Xanax and went to sleep. One of the things that they point out is that Jessica was very conscious about her appearance, that she always had her makeup on. She was always kind of dressed up. She wanted, whenever she left the house, she did herself up. So when she was found, she had no makeup on, and it was in a very bizarre way. And that's why they kind of referenced that if this would have happened, she would have done herself up like Sleeping Beauty, and she would have taken the Xanax, so that when she was found, she was in a kind of a way, an appearance that she normally would have been. Not without makeup on, basically tied to a mailbox in a hanging position. And if you look at the photos that are kind of associated with this, it's a very odd way that someone might commit suicide. But it is a way that people have done in the past and will probably continue to do. The thing about suicides is that we can't always point out exactly what's going on at the time that the event takes place. And there is a lot of strange ways that people decide to commit suicide when they finally decide to do it, whether that is planned out or whether it is spontaneous. But going back to Garland, he says that after he spoke with Jessica, he was at another woman's house when all of this supposedly was going on, and that he had not seen her since he left the friend's house. And he actually had his alibi backed up by the woman that he said he was with. And so he is never actually considered a suspect in this case. He's never formally a suspect. He's never really questioned as a suspect. He's just kind of talked to get his backstory. The friend's house that they were also at, he was talked to by police. He also, interestingly, had a camera that was at his residence, multiple cameras, one pointing out towards the roadway where the mailbox was. But that video evidence was never collected by police. They never asked for it, and the friend never offered it up. And I think that is very interesting because it seems like you would want to go ahead and get a hold of that video footage. I don't know if that was another misstep by the police department that was involved, or if potentially they just didn't see the camera. However, later when interviewed by a news outlet, he said that he had never gone and actually tried to look at the footage. And then when the reporter says, well, can we go look at it? He basically says, well, I don't know the passcode to get into the camera system. So we got a guy that's got a camera system at his house that has a TV with a monitor on it showing the camera angles and where they go to. He's got a system set up to record said cameras, but he doesn't have the passcode to look at it. And police never press him, so time marches on. No one ever goes back. This is a situation where the police have ruled this a suicide and they move on. There's no reason to look into it any further. We've got a person who was laid up next to a mailbox. We have her shoes next to her body. The laces are removed from the shoes. The laces are then tied together. It's kind of put in a figure 8 pattern. It's looped around the mailbox. Open and shut case, guys. Let's get on out of here. And I know that now looking back on it, there might be some details that we don't have, some information that the police department did not share with the public. And that's the way it goes in cases like this. They could have reached that decision based off numerous factors that maybe we don't have the info for. And that's frustrating whenever we're talking about cases where there's such a split on what exactly happened. And Jessica's family is definitely feeling like something is out of whack here. So they hire a private forensic scientist named Dr. Maurice Godwin. And he starts looking into the case. Also, they get some help from a former police officer that worked in that town to kind of look over the case to help them out, because they feel very strongly that this was not a suicide. And the forensic scientist that they hired, Dr. Godwin, he believes that they are correct. He says that there are a lot of things that don't make sense as far as this supposed suicide goes. Some of the things that he does not feel like were handled correctly are the determination of death. Whenever Jessica died, they said it was asphyxiation by hanging. He said that in this situation, they could have checked it as undetermined or pending investigation, but they didn't do that. One of the things that Dr. Godwin points out is that Jessica's body being found on the ground with her knees bent and her neck tied at a waist-high mailbox with shoestrings fashioned like a noose, that basically based on the way that the string is around her neck, she would not have been able to pass out in any way, because he did not think there was enough pressure to cut the air off on her neck. He said that the positioning of her body against the mailbox also doesn't make sense, because the majority of the force and pressure was on her cheekbone. In that position, Jessica would have been in excruciating pain. So supposedly she is alive when all of this takes place, and she has to basically sit down. She has to put up with the pressure of that shoelace on her jaw going to the edge of basically that 4x4 wooden post. And then supposedly because of this, she passes away. She dies. And then he says, quote, "It never happened. Never happened." And a lot of this that I'm reading at this time comes from the Daily Crime Watch article, and I'll post a link to this article in the show notes. One of the other things that he points out is he says, in my opinion, she did not tie the knot used to put the shoelaces together. It is so precisely tied, really close to the end. So to me, that would be difficult to do without proper lighting. Because where we're talking about in this case is it's out in a rural area. There are no streetlights. There is nothing on this roadway that is lit in any way. So she would have been, presumably, if this was during the nighttime, which they believe it to be, sometime after 3:29 a.m., it would have been pitch black outside, and somehow she ties this precise knot in these shoelaces, puts it in a figure 8 pattern, like sort of like a noose, and then hooks it around the mailbox. Dr. Godwin also brings up Jessica's purse. And in this, he says that if Jessica would have hanged herself, she would not have remained resting up on top of the purse that was sitting kind of between her legs. And he questioned the way that her hair, which appears to be entangled in the shoelace, which I mentioned earlier, that the hair is kind of tied up around this shoelace that goes around her neck. And there have been a lot of people point at this because they said if this was planned out, she probably would have cleared the hair away from her neck before she fashioned the shoelace around it. Another thing that he points out is he says, why would you want to hang yourself basically from, and I'm paraphrasing some of this, why would you want to use the mailbox when there are plenty of trees around? This is a heavily wooded area that she's in, and she basically chose this mailbox. He further says, referring to the trees, that there are a lot of low-lying limbs around. So when choosing the mailbox as the point to commit suicide, it came off to him as a little strange. Dr. Godwin and the family, I think both believe that there was someone else with Jessica when all this happened, or some other persons, and there was some sort of a struggle, and that's what led to Jessica's death. And basically, the hanging was just a front to cover that up, so it looked like that she took her own life and nobody would basically look at them. Another thing he points out is those holes in Jessica's left hand. And this is something I believe that everybody is kind of baffled about. I haven't really heard of a good explanation as to how these injuries got to her left hand. Someone mentioned that in the preliminary autopsy, they suggested that it might have been from gravel or something like that, the hand dragging against that. But there's no real definite answer as to how that exactly happened. And where this case kind of takes a interesting turn is that the evidence. Well, can we go back and look at the evidence that we had at the time of the death so that we can maybe formulate a different opinion, conclusion, get some sort of DNA evidence done, because none of this was done at the time. But when we start looking at the evidence itself, it kind of gets kind of goes down one of those paths where we're like, oh boy, how does this kind of stuff happen? So we'll start with the shoelaces. The shoelaces that were used came from a pair of shoes that Jessica's family said she didn't own. More specifically, they said that the clothes that she was wearing on the night in which she died, they did not recognize at all. And I've looked at the pictures of Jessica, and I believe that the clothes she is wearing fit her. I don't know if I would say that this was something that was just thrown on her in a last-minute effort to clothe her, because the clothes appear to fit her, but that's something I'll get into later. But the shoelaces that came from these shoes that no one recognized are gone. They are missing. Like we've heard so many times in other cases, that evidence has somehow disappeared. We also had the clothes that Jessica was wearing the night that she died. Those clothes, for whatever reason, were basically put into a biohazard bag, and they believe that what happened is after the clothes were released with the body, they went to the funeral home or crematorium where she was sent to, and the clothes, along with her body, they are thought to have been incinerated. So now the clothes are gone, and the shoelaces are gone. And the purse that was found with Jessica was later returned back to the family, and also the shoes. So if there was anything that they found, now that evidence has been contaminated. It's been released back to the family, and it can't be used unless they figure out a way to kind of tie this back to someone specifically. But I feel like there's going to be some questions raised, if it's ever done, of a chain of custody situation. We've talked about that a little bit in the show, and it can get pretty dicey. So the way that I feel is any of the evidence that would be with the purse or with the shoes is now no good. And I don't even think that the police noticed before they gave the purse back that the strap on the purse was broken. And Dr. Godwin also says that there is a speck on the shoe that appears to be blood, and it does not look like anybody has ever tested that for DNA to see if it is in fact blood, or if it is, who it belongs to. So there's a lot of things that have happened in this case that kind of point that perhaps it was poorly investigated, and not only with the kind of loss of evidence and lack of direction while they were collecting evidence, there's also a couple photos of the scene that shows kind of how everybody is situated at this crime scene. And the first thing that I noticed is both the mail carrier vehicles are pulled directly up to the mailbox. After that, there are several police cars that are pulled up next to those vehicles, and it doesn't look like there was a lot of space given to where this crime scene could be properly investigated. And one of the reasons I think that is because initially when they showed up, they thought it was probably a clear-cut case of suicide. And that's why we're kind of going in this direction that we're going right now. And I know some of you guys are probably thinking to yourself right now, well, what about Jessica's cell phone? There's been mention of some text messages coming in and out, perhaps some phone calls. What about Jessica's cell phone? Well, Jessica's cell phone was never looked at by anybody. So at the time when they found her cell phone, it had a passcode lock on it that you had to use a thumbprint to open or type in the code, and no one knew the code to Jessica's phone. A lot of people said that why didn't the police use her thumbprint on scene to unlock the phone so they can go in, look into it? But apparently that was not something that they thought about until after she had already been cremated. And this is very unfortunate because in the interviews I saw with the family, they said that Apple has not unlocked the phone for them and said that they can't do it. And there has been no further attempts to try to get the phone unlocked by any other means. So her phone that might hold some evidence on it, might hold the key to this whole thing, has never been looked at. And I find that kind of crazy because even if you remember back to the Tom Brown case, they were able to send that phone off to the FBI crime lab and they were able to unlock it and get into it. And this is one of those situations where I feel like if there's this much speculation that is going on about what happened to Jessica exactly, why can't we send this phone off to somewhere that can possibly crack it? I know that it is extremely hard to do those things, but I feel like it is something that nonetheless could be done. And one of the other things that I kind of find interesting in this case is there's not a whole lot going around about the details of what her on again, off again boyfriend Garland's side of the story is, what the friend's side of the story is. And that is because no one's really asked. As I mentioned earlier, Garland was never considered a suspect in the case, and neither was his friend. So I don't know if there are formal interviews where they spoke with police and it was recorded and there were statements given, or if it was more of just a meeting between Garland and the police, kind of talking about the events that led up to it in a kind of casual manner where they were just trying to get information. I feel like that would still be recorded somewhere, but as far as I know, none of that information has been released. The only information that we did get from Garland is when he was actually going to a court appearance to face charges against another assault on a different female, the one who gave him the alibi the night that Jessica was murdered. He says that on the night that Jessica died, he was with another woman. She gave him the alibi, as I've already mentioned, that he loved Jessica and that anybody that knows him knows that he could never do anything to hurt her. And he says that he voluntarily went in for police questioning and was fully cooperative, and that he had been cleared in the investigation, which I think is kind of a funny way of saying it, that he was cleared, but you can't necessarily be cleared if you were never truly a suspect. And then he kind of comes back and says that he doesn't want his name cleared because he doesn't care. It doesn't mean anything to him because in the end, Jessica is still not going to be here. But if somebody did do something to her, he wanted to know who did it because her son, her daughter deserve to know. When he was asked if he knew of anybody that would want to hurt Jessica, he says that he doesn't know. And he says that he doesn't want to pass any accusations on anyone because that is basically what everybody is doing to him, and he just doesn't know. But he does understand why the family is so confused and has so many questions. He said, quote, "I understand that. I'm not mad at them in any way." He says, "I'm not a lawyer and I don't know. I shouldn't be doing this right now. It's not wise on my behalf in any kind of way, but I don't care. I will die in prison as an old man just to know they got who did that to her." And it's kind of chopped up the way that he said it, and it came from a live interview, so they just kind of pieced it together. That quote's also from Crime Watch Daily. But basically what he's saying, and also the friend that was at the house is saying, is that they also don't believe that Jessica committed suicide, which is kind of a weird statement coming from the last people supposedly that ever saw her. You have a couple of guys that have some shady past that deal in drugs and have been to prison and all of these extra things that go with that, who say, well, we don't know what happened to Jessica, but we were probably the last ones that anybody knows was with her, but we didn't do anything to her, but we do think that something happened to her. The friend of Garland and Garland himself both say they do not believe that Jessica committed suicide. So that's kind of a weird way that this whole thing kind of twists at the end, because it's a situation where the police are the only ones basically that are involved that knew Jessica that said that she committed suicide. The friends, the family, the ex-boyfriend, the ex-boyfriend's friend, all of these people are saying they do not believe that Jessica committed suicide, that they believe that something happened to her. But what evidence do we have that something actually happened to her? Well, right now we don't have a whole lot. We don't have a whole lot that says that, well, this is something we can directly point at and say could have happened to her. We've got a lot of speculation. We got a lot of people talking. We got a lot of stories that are flying around, but we don't have anything concrete that we can hold on to. What we do know is that on June 2nd, 2017, Jessica died, and the circumstances of her death are very suspicious. And we have one group saying it was a murder. We have another group saying that it was a suicide, more specifically, the police that are saying it's a suicide. And there's a lot of details that kind of go into this, as far as things that the friends said, things that the family said, a lot further about a lot more details about kind of how the body was found and positioning, and things that I want to get into in the debrief. But you guys know how we do the story. I like to give you the facts up front, the things that kind of happened, just to give you a baseline. And then Mike and I are going to dive into this. Mike and I have already been talking about this case as far as it goes, because it's very odd. Now, I do want to mention straightforward that on the Murder Project, we go straight down the middle. So I would like to discuss ways on how this could have been a suicide. And I would also like to discuss ways on how this could have been a murder. I know that a lot of people truly believe that this was, in fact, a murder. And this is no offense to anybody or the family, but the way that we break these things down is we look at it from both sides. I know if you've been listening to this podcast a lot, you already know that that's the way that we do things. But anybody that's new, that just started listening to the show, that may not have heard us take like a really deep dive on these and give our opinions, this is how it goes. And I know that in some areas that can make people a little bit angry, but I'm not taking anything away from Jessica or any of the cases that we do, for that matter. I'm not trying to take anything away from the person, the victims, the families, anything like that. I'm just trying to look at it objectively and say, this is what we see. Because I also asked one of my friends that is a crime scene investigator if he would kind of look at some of the things, and we had a kind of back and forth. And there's a lot of things that he pointed out that were kind of the same way that I was tracking it. It is a very hard thing to do, to look back several years after things have happened and kind of give your best judgment on what you think might have happened. But we always try to do our best. And my point about that is, it's at no offense to anybody. It's just a observation. That's all. And it's not to take sides with anybody or anything like that. I wanted to mention that because when we come back and do the debrief, we are going to, in fact, take a pretty deep dive on this. And we're going to throw out a lot of different things that might have happened, that could have happened, and see if we can't bring some more information to this case, or see if we can't kind of close the gaps where there could be some. I don't think for a second that we are going to solve this crime, sitting behind a kitchen table, but we do like to talk about the cases and get involved and kind of get people thinking about different things maybe that they might not have normally thought about. That is the point of the whole thing as far as the debrief goes. Plus, I get to hang out with my best bud, Mike. So I think I'm going to leave it there for this episode, and I will talk to you guys soon on the debrief. I can't wait. It's going to be a pretty good show. I will see you guys there next time. Goodbye. Thank you guys so much for tuning in and listening to this episode of The Murder Project. Our numbers are going up, our downloads are going up, and we have you guys to thank for that. If you're looking for us on any of the social media platforms, you can find us on Facebook. We're at The Murder Project. If you need to search for us, type in facebook.com/podcaststmp. If you're looking for us on Instagram, we're at The Murder Project. And if you're looking for us on Twitter, we are at The Murder Pod. Also, please go over to whatever platform you're listening on. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. If you're listening on Spotify, make sure you hit subscribe. Our numbers are going up on that. We appreciate it. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, hit that 5-star and please leave us a review. That helps us out so much and we appreciate it. If you need to send us a longer form question or comment, you can reach out to us by email. That email address is contact@themurderproject.com. And as always, Mike or myself will get back to you. Thank you guys so much for tuning in and listening to this episode. I look forward to speaking to you in the future. But before I go, please remember, head up, eyes up, and stay alive.